The whip came down before she could draw a breath. Clara Gray did not scream. She bit through the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, and she kept her eyes open, because she had decided standing at the forge the night before alone, and shaking, that she would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. The rope burned her wrists. The morning air was cold. The whole town of Harlan's Creek had come out to watch, and not a single soul moved to stop it. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever been judged by people who didn't know your whole truth, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Every comment means the world to me, and it tells me you're still here. Now let's go back to that Sunday morning in Harlan's Creek, because what happened next nobody saw coming.
Becky.
The preacher's name was Elias Croft, and he believed with the full terrifying conviction of a man who had never once doubted himself that what he was doing was righteous. He stood on the church steps in his black coat, his Bible tucked under his left arm, and the leather strap in his right hand, and he read aloud from a sheet of paper he'd written himself the night before. His voice carried all the way to the edge of the square. Clara heard every word. She heard fornication. She heard disgrace. She heard example must be made. She heard her own name spoken like a curse, and she pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and stared at a knot in the wooden post they had tied her to, and she thought, I will not fall. She was 7 months along. Nobody mentioned that part. The rope around her wrists was rough and had been tied by Harlan Potts, the town's deputy, a man Clara had once helped nurse through a fever when his wife was too exhausted to do it herself. He hadn't looked at her while he tied the knot. He'd looked at his own boots. "You are a shame upon this community," Preacher Croft said loud enough for the crowd to hear. "You are a shame upon the memory of your father, God rest him. And today, before this congregation, you will be reminded of your place." The first strike landed across her shoulders. Clara's jaw clenched so hard she thought her teeth might crack. She gripped the post with her bound hands and held on. The wood was old and splintered, and it bit into her palms, and she was grateful for it. Grateful for something to hold, something real, something that wasn't the sound of a few women in the crowd who were crying quietly and doing nothing. "Cry out," someone muttered behind her. She didn't know who. "Just cry out and he'll stop." She didn't cry out. The second strike came, then the third, each one slower than the last, as though Croft wanted the crowd to feel the weight of each one, wanted them to understand that this was serious, that this was necessary, that God's will was being carried out here on a cold Tuesday morning in Harlan's Creek, Kansas, in the year of our Lord, 1883. Clara counted the strikes the way she counted hammer blows at the forge, with a kind of mechanical steadiness, with the part of her brain that had learned long ago to separate the body's suffering from the mind's survival. She had learned that in her father's house long before she'd learned it anywhere else. Her father had been a hard man, not cruel, but hard, and the hardness had left something in her, a place inside her chest that could go quiet when everything else was screaming. She went to that place now. She thought about her son. She thought about the way he moved inside her. Not often, but sometimes at night, when she was lying still and the forge had gone cold, a small, determined rolling motion that felt like a fist unclenching. She'd been calling him Thomas in her head after her father, even though she wasn't sure she'd keep that name when the time came. She thought about whether he could feel what was happening to her right now, whether it reached him somehow, whether he was afraid. She hoped he wasn't afraid. She heard a sound from somewhere in the crowd. Not crying, not jeering. Just a single sharp intake of breath, the kind a person makes when they've seen something they weren't expecting. Then, murmuring, low and uncertain. The whip did not come down a fourth time. Clara waited. She heard Preacher Croft say, "Now see here," and then nothing. She turned her head. The man was walking through the crowd, the way water moves around a stone, steady, unhurried, leaving no room for argument. People stepped aside without quite knowing why. He was tall, and he was wearing a dark leather vest over a worn cotton shirt, and his hat was the color of old straw, and his beard was dark and full, and he had the kind of eyes that had seen a great deal and chosen to keep most of it to themselves. He didn't look angry. He didn't look like he was there to fight. He looked like a man who had made a decision some time earlier and was now simply carrying it out. He walked past the preacher without looking at him. He walked to the post. He reached into the pocket of his vest and produced a short-bladed knife, and he cut the rope around Clara's wrists in 2 clean strokes, and then he put the knife away. Clara's arms dropped. The blood rushed back into her hands all at once, and it burned like fire, and her knees buckled. She'd been holding herself upright so long that the moment the tension was gone, her body simply gave out, and he caught her. Both arms steady, no hesitation, as though he'd been expecting it. He didn't say anything. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders. It was heavy, worn leather, and it smelled like wood smoke, and something darker, like iron. And he turned to face the crowd with Clara against his side, and he just stood there. Preacher Croft found his voice first. "You have no authority here, stranger. This is a matter of—" "I heard what you said it was a matter of." The man's voice was low and even, not loud. He didn't raise it. "I heard it fine." "Then you understand that this woman has sinned against—" "I understand," the man said, "that you've been hitting a pregnant woman with a leather strap in front of about 40 people on a Tuesday morning, and every one of those 40 people is going to have to live with that." He looked out at the crowd when he said it. Not accusatory, just matter of fact, like a man reading off figures in a ledger. "That's between you and whatever you believe in. I'm not here to argue theology." "Then what are you here for?" someone called from the crowd. He didn't answer that. He looked at Deputy Potts. "You got anything to say about this?" Harlan Potts looked at his boots again. He shook his head. "All right then." The man shifted Clara's weight slightly, making sure she was steady. "We're going to walk now, ma'am, if you can manage it. You just lean on me as much as you need to." Clara looked up at him. She'd never seen him before in her life, she was certain of that. And yet there was something she couldn't name. It couldn't locate at some quality in the way he looked at her that didn't feel like a stranger's look. It felt like the look of someone who already knew the outcome and wasn't worried about it. "I can walk," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I reckon you can." They walked. Nobody stopped them. His name was Eli Maddox, and he'd come to Harlan's Creek 3 days earlier, though nobody had taken particular notice of him. He'd taken a room at the boarding house on the south end of town, paid a week in advance, eaten his meals quietly, and spent a good deal of time sitting in the chair outside his room, reading what appeared to be letters, old ones worn at the folds, the kind of letters a person reads many times. He told Clara his name that afternoon, when she'd stopped shaking enough to sit up on the cot in the back room of a widow's house on the edge of town. The widow's name was Dora Marsh, and she was 63 years old, and had decided many years ago that she was done caring what Harlan's Creek thought of her. She'd taken one look at Clara and Eli walking up her path and opened the door without a word. "Eli Maddox," he said when Clara asked. He was sitting across the room near the window with his hat in his hands. "I used to work for Pinkerton, before." "Before what?" He looked at his hat. "Before I stopped." Clara studied him. Her back was burning. Dora had cleaned the welts and wrapped them in cool cloths and said very little which Clara appreciated. "Why did you come to Harlan's Creek?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his vest and took out something small and held it across to her. It was a folded piece of paper. Clara took it And when she opened it, she found a sketch pencil on yellowed paper, worn soft at the creases of a man and a small girl. The man was holding the girl's hand. The girl couldn't have been more than 5. Beneath the drawing in small, careful handwriting were 2 words, Clara, Thomas. Clara's breath stopped. "That's my father," she said. Her voice was barely a sound. "Yes, ma'am." "And that's—" She looked up at him. "Where did you get this?" "My mother drew it," he said. "She was an artist. Couldn't help herself, saw a face worth drawing, and she drew it. Your father sat with her once out on the Grafton land when you were just small. She said he was one of the few men around who ever treated her like a person." He paused. "My mother's name was Miriam Grafton." The room was very still. "Miriam," Clara said slowly. "I remember a Miriam. She lived out past the creek. She had—" She stopped. Something was assembling itself in her memory slowly, the way things come back when you haven't thought of them in a long time. She had a son, a quiet boy. He used to sit outside the school and watch the other children, but he never— She looked at him. "He never came inside." Eli said nothing. "They wouldn't let him," Clara said. "Not a question." "No," Eli said. "They wouldn't." Clara looked at the sketch again, her father's face gentle and tired the way she remembered it, her own small hand in his. She felt something move behind her eyes, not grief exactly, more like the feeling of a locked door that had just been found to have a key. "You came all this way because of a drawing your mother made 30 years ago," she said. "I came," Eli said, "because I'd heard some things about what was happening to you, and I knew your name, and I figured—" He stopped, turned his hat in his hands. "I figured somebody ought to know your name before they—" He stopped again. "Before they what?" "Before they made you forget it," he said quietly. Clara looked at him for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the yard, and Dora Marsh could be heard in the kitchen, the sound of a pot being set on an iron stove, the ordinary sounds of a life continuing. "You didn't say a word to me," Clara said, "when you cut the rope. You just—" "I didn't figure you needed words right then." "No," she said. "I didn't." She folded the sketch carefully and held it in both hands and looked at it, and she didn't cry. She had not cried once that entire morning, and she wasn't going to start now. But something in her chest loosened some knot that had been pulled tight for so long, she'd forgotten it was there. "They're going to say you compromised yourself," she said, "coming after me like that. In this town, a man who defends a woman like me. I know what they'll say. It doesn't concern you." Eli looked at her steadily. "Miss Gray," he said, "I grew up the son of a woman this town decided wasn't worth their respect. I know exactly what they say and what it's worth." He stood up. He was not a demonstrative man. She could see that expression came cautiously in him, that words were things he spent carefully. But there was something in the way he stood that was completely certain. "I'm going to go speak to Dora about whether she can keep you here a few days. You need to rest. We can talk more when you're stronger." He moved toward the door. "Mr. Maddox," Clara said. He stopped. "I don't know why you came," she said. "I don't know what you thought was going to happen or what you want or—" She shook her head. "But I'm glad you were there. That's all. I just wanted to say that." Eli Maddox stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am." And that was all, and he went to find Dora Marsh. Clara had come to Harlan's Creek 4 years ago after her father died and left her the forge and a small house and a debt she'd spent the first 2 years paying off hammer blow by hammer blow. Thomas Gray had been the town's blacksmith for 20 years. He'd been good at it, better than good, meticulous and honest, the kind of craftsman who took pride that was genuine rather than performed. He'd raised Clara alone after her mother left when Clara was 7, and he'd raised her the only way he knew how, which was to show her how to do things with her hands and trust that she'd figure out the rest. She had figured out the rest. She'd taken over the forge without anyone asking her to. There hadn't been a discussion or a transfer of ownership. Her father died on a Wednesday, and on Friday, Clara had gone into the forge, banked the fire, and started working. If anyone in Harlan's Creek had an opinion about a woman running a blacksmith operation, they'd kept it mostly to themselves, because Clara Gray's work was good, and her prices were fair, and people needed their tools sharpened and their horses shod, and their wagon hinges replaced, and she did all of it without complaint. The trouble had started in February, when it became clear she was expecting. There was no husband. Clara had never claimed there was. She had not offered explanations, and she had not asked for sympathy, and she had not gone to the preacher or the women's quilting circle or anyone else to account for herself. She had kept working. She had let her body change, and she had kept waking up before dawn and banking the fire and working until she couldn't stand anymore, and she had been preparing in her own quiet and methodical way for what was coming. But Harlan's Creek had its own preparation to do. By March, certain women had stopped bringing her their mending. By April, Preacher Croft had delivered 2 sermons that were clearly aimed at her without naming her directly. By May, boys had started throwing things at the forge windows, rocks, once a dead sparrow, and Clara had cleaned up each time and said nothing. By June, there had been a meeting at the church that she had not been invited to, and after that meeting, a delegation of 3 men, the preacher, the deputy, and a merchant named Cole Whitfield, who had never once spoken directly to Clara in 4 years, had come to inform her that the community had decided she needed to be corrected. She had stood in the doorway of the forge with a hammer in her hand and told them what they could do with that decision. That had been 2 weeks ago. This morning had been the consequence. They'd come for her before sunup, 4 men and 2 women she didn't recognize, and they'd been organized about it in a way that told her Preacher Croft had been planning it for some time. They'd taken the hammer from her hand. It had taken 3 of them, and bound her wrists, and walked her through the streets while the town woke up and came to its windows, and then came outside, drawn by the spectacle of it, the way people are always drawn. God help them to someone else's suffering. She hadn't spoken during any of it. She hadn't begged. She hadn't made it easier for them by weeping or breaking or doing any of the things they seemed to expect her to do. She had gone rigid and silent and walked with her head up, and she had thought, I will remember every face. She was still thinking it now, lying on Dora Marsh's cot, with her back wrapped in cool cloths, and a cup of tea going cold on the table beside her, and the sketch of her father in her hands. She would remember every face. And she was going to need a plan. She didn't know yet that the plan was already sitting in the next room talking quietly to an old widow about whether the weather was turning his hat in his hands, saying very little and meaning almost everything. The plan, as it turned out, began with a piece of paper. Clara had always believed in paper. Her father had taught her that, not in so many words because Thomas Gray was not a man of many words, but in practice. He had kept every receipt, every bill of sale, every letter of agreement he had ever entered into, folded and organized in a tin box under the floorboard of the forge. A man's word is worth what the day gives it. He had told her once when she was maybe 12, and watching him file a document away with the same care he gave to a piece of fine metalwork. But paper. Paper remembers even when people don't want it to. Clara had inherited the tin box. She had added to it, and on the morning of the second day at Dora Marsh's house, when the pain in her back had settled from screaming to a deep manageable ache, and she could sit upright without gripping the edge of the cot, the first thing she asked for was something to write with. Dora brought her a pencil and a sheet of paper without asking why, which was one of the many reasons Clara had decided she liked Dora Marsh. She wrote for 2 hours. She wrote names. She wrote dates. She wrote every incident she could recall with specificity, not impressions, not feelings, but facts. The date the rocks were thrown at the forge windows. The names of the men who had come to her door in June. The exact words Preacher Croft had read from his handwritten sheet that Tuesday morning. The fact that Deputy Potts had been present and had taken no action. The fact that she had been 7 months pregnant in plain sight, and that not one of the 40-some people watching had intervened. When Eli came in with coffee that Dora had sent with him, he found her sitting up in the cot with the paper on her knee and the pencil moving steadily, and her face arranged in an expression of absolute concentration. He set the coffee down and started to leave. "Sit down," Clara said without looking up. "I want to talk to you about something." He sat. She finished the sentence she was writing, then looked up. "You said you worked for Pinkerton." "That's right." "How long?" 8 years. "Doing what kind of work?" He was quiet for a moment. "Investigations mostly. Fraud, land disputes, a few criminal cases." He looked at his hands. "The kind of work where you spend a lot of time looking at documents and not very much time shooting at people, which suited me fine." Clara looked at him steadily. "Can you still read a land title?" "Yes." "Can you recognize a forged signature?" Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, but a kind of heightened attention. "What are you thinking, Miss Gray?" "I'm thinking," Clara said, "that Preacher Croft does not act without backing. A man like that, with that kind of organized cruelty, someone is giving him permission. Someone with influence and something to gain." She tapped the pencil against the paper. "My father left me the forge and the property. It's worth something. Not a fortune, but it's the only smithing operation within 30 miles, and the land it sits on is good land. Cole Whitfield has wanted it since before my father died. He made an offer 2 weeks after the funeral, and I told him no. He made another offer 6 months later. I told him no again." "And now," Eli said slowly, "you're being publicly shamed and run out of respectable society." "Now I'm being publicly shamed and run out of respectable society," Clara agreed. "And if I leave, if they break me enough that I pack up and go, the forge sits empty. My father had a small outstanding debt when he died, which I have almost finished paying, but not quite. If I'm gone, if I'm discredited, if I can't work—" She stopped. "There is a provision in the original loan agreement. If the property falls into abandonment, or the debtor is deemed by a local officer of the law to be incapable of managing affairs, the debt can be called in immediately," Eli said, "and the land reverts to the lender as collateral." "Who's the lender?" Clara looked at him. "Cole Whitfield." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse went past on the road, hooves measured and slow in the morning quiet. Eli leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "You think Whitfield is behind Croft?" "I think Whitfield funds Croft's church renovation. I think Whitfield has business interests that align very neatly with Deputy Potts keeping his job. And I think that Tuesday morning was not about my morals." She said the last word with a precision that made it clear she was not interested in discussing her morals. "It was about my property. It was about breaking me down far enough that no one in this town would take my side, so that when the debt gets called and the land gets taken, everyone would shrug and say she had it coming." Eli looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You figured all of this out lying on a cot with a sore back in 2 days." "I figured most of it out before Tuesday morning. I just needed someone to say it out loud to." She paused. "You're the first person I've been able to say it to." He absorbed that. She saw him absorb it, saw the small shift in his jaw, the slight adjustment of his posture. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "I need to know if the loan agreement can be challenged. I need to know if what was done to me on Tuesday constitutes an actionable offense under Kansas law. And I need to know if there's a federal jurisdiction that supersedes Harlan Potts and his convenient boots." Eli said nothing for a moment. Then very quietly he said, "There's a federal circuit judge who covers this territory. Name's Arthur Beaumont. I worked a case with him once in Abilene. He's a fair man." "Can you get a message to him?" I can. Will you? Eli looked at her, that steady, unhurried look, the one she was beginning to recognize as his version of deliberation. Miss Gray, he said, I came to Harlan's Creek because I heard your name and I thought someone should. I didn't come with a plan. I came with... He stopped. I came with the intention of making sure you were still standing. You're still standing. More than standing. He glanced at the paper on her knee. You're already 3 steps ahead of everybody who hurt you. So yes, I'll get a message to Beaumont. I'll do whatever you need. But I want you to understand something. What? This is going to get worse before it gets better. If Whitfield and Croft figure out that you're not running, and they'll figure it out, they're going to push harder. I know that. You're 7 months along. Dora can keep you here a while, but... I know, Clara said. Her voice was level. I've thought about all of it. I've been thinking about all of it for months, Mr. Maddox. Every night at the forge, every morning, I woke up and saw what was coming. She looked down at the paper. I am not unaware of my situation. No, Eli said quietly. You're not. He stood up, picked up his hat. I'll ride out today and find a courier I can trust. Beaumont keeps a circuit office in Dodge. A letter should reach him within the week. Clara nodded. Then, Mr. Maddox. Eli. It was the first time she'd used his given name. He stopped. Why did your mother keep drawing after everything this town did to her? He thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, standing there with his hat in his hands, and she appreciated that he didn't answer quickly. She said it was the only thing nobody could take from her, he said finally. She could draw what she saw, and nobody could make her unsee it. He went to the door. That's how I feel about paper, Clara said mostly to herself. He left. Clara picked up the pencil and kept writing. The town of Harlan's Creek did not leave her alone for long. Dora Marsh had lived in her house for 31 years and had cultivated over those decades a reputation for eccentricity that functioned as a kind of social armor. People in town said she was peculiar. They said she'd been strange ever since her husband died. They said she kept odd hours and odd company, and that you couldn't predict what she might do. All of this was true, and Dora had worked very hard to make it true, because it meant that most people left her alone, and being left alone was, in Dora Marsh's estimation, one of the great gifts of this mortal life. But on the 3rd day of Clara's stay, a woman came to the door. Her name was Ruth Hennessy. She was 42, and the wife of the town's only doctor, and she was carrying a cloth-covered basket that she held in front of her like a shield. When Dora opened the door, Ruth looked past her immediately, trying to see into the house. I heard she was here, Ruth said. Lots of people hear lots of things, Dora said pleasantly. I want to see her. I'm not... Ruth stopped, adjusted her grip on the basket. I'm not here to cause any trouble. Dora considered her. What are you here for? I'm here because I watched Tuesday happen, and I didn't do anything, and I've been sick about it since. Ruth's voice was flat and direct, not dramatic, not tearful, just honest in the way that some people get when they've been arguing with themselves for 3 days and finally given up. I brought bread and some of my husband's salve for her back. Dora let her in. Clara was sitting at the small table by the window papers spread out in front of her when Ruth Hennessy came into the room. Ruth stopped in the doorway and looked at her, and Clara looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. You brought bread, Clara said. And salve. Ruth held out the basket. My husband, he wanted to come himself, but he thought you might not want. He was right. Clara took the basket, set it on the table, looked at it, then looked at Ruth. You want to say something? Ruth squared her shoulders. I want to say I'm sorry. I know it doesn't. I know that's not worth much right now. But I was standing there, and I couldn't make my feet move, and I've been ashamed of myself every hour since, and She stopped. I wanted you to know that not everyone in this town thinks what was done to you was right. How many don't? Clara said. Blunt, not hostile, just blunt. Ruth blinked. I beg your pardon. Of the 40 people standing in that square, how many don't think it was right? Do you have a number? Ruth opened her mouth, closed it. I don't. I need to know, Clara said, whether I have any allies in this town. Because what I'm planning is going to require people who are willing to say publicly what they're willing to say privately. And I've learned, Mrs. Hennessy, that those are often very different populations. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly she sat down across the table from her. She put her hands flat on the table, and Clara noticed they were steady. Tell me what you're planning, Ruth said. Clara studied her. There was something in Ruth Hennessy's face that she recognized, the expression of someone who had been agreeable for a long time and was very tired of it. Clara knew that expression. She'd worn it herself for the first year after her father died, when she'd been trying to make herself palatable enough that the town would let her work in peace. There's a federal circuit judge named Arthur Beaumont, Clara said. He's going to want sworn statements from witnesses, people who saw what happened Tuesday morning, people who can speak to the pattern of what's been done to me over the past several months, people who know things about Cole Whitfield's financial arrangements with the church and with the deputy. Ruth was very still. You think you can bring a case? I know I can bring a case. The question is whether anyone in this town is brave enough to support one. Croft has a lot of influence here. Croft has a lot of influence over frightened people, Clara said, which is a different thing and one that tends to evaporate the moment someone in the room stops being frightened. She paused. You're not frightened, Mrs. Hennessy. I can see that. Ruth looked at her hands. I'm a little frightened. That's all right. Brave people are always a little frightened. That's what makes it brave. Clara tapped the papers in front of her. Can I tell you what I have so far? Ruth looked up. Yes, she said. Tell me. So Clara told her. She laid it out the way her father had taught her to lay out a piece of work methodically from the foundation up without embellishment. She told Ruth about the debt and the land provision. She told Ruth about Whitfield's offers and Croft's sermons and the escalation she had documented month by month. She told Ruth about Eli Maddox and the letter going to Beaumont. And Ruth Hennessy sat across from her and listened without interrupting and without looking away. And by the time Clara finished, her expression had done something particular. It had gone from careful to resolved. My husband, Ruth said, has been the doctor in this town for 16 years. He's delivered most of the children here. He has treated Croft's congregation and Whitfield's workers alike. People talk to a doctor in ways they don't talk to anyone else. She paused. He knows things. Is he willing to say them? I think, Ruth said carefully, that after Tuesday morning he's willing to have a conversation about what he's willing to say. She stood up. I'll talk to him tonight, and I'll talk to 2 other women I trust. She met Clara's eyes. We didn't stop it when we should have, but we can do something now. Yes, Clara said. You can. After Ruth left, Clara sat alone at the table for a while. She wasn't accustomed to receiving help. She wasn't even entirely comfortable with it. There was something in her that went cautious and still when people offered her things, because she had learned that most offers came with a cost that revealed itself later. But something about Ruth Hennessy had felt different. Something about the steadiness of her hands and the directness of her speech and the absence of any sweetness in her apology, just plain honest regret offered plainly. Clara was thinking about this when she heard the front door and then Eli's boots in the hallway. And then he appeared in the doorway. The letter's on its way, he said. Good. She told him about Ruth Hennessy. He listened. Then he said, Your father was right about paper, but he forgot one thing. What's that? People, Eli said. Paper is evidence. but people are witnesses, and a judge can weigh a document, but a jury. He stopped. If it comes to that. If it comes to that, Clara agreed. She thought about what he'd said. Then she thought about her son, turning slowly in the quiet dark of her patient, and unbothered waiting for the world to be ready for him. She put her hand over the place where he was and felt the small, certain presence of him. She had paper. She was getting witnesses. She had a man who said very little and meant almost everything sitting in the doorway of a borrowed room. She was not beaten. She was barely even started. The letter reached Judge Arthur Beaumont in 11 days. Eli knew because on the 12th day, a writer came back with a response, not a long one, not elaborate, just a single folded sheet with a federal court seal pressed into the wax, and 7 words written inside in a tight, deliberate hand, "I will be there within the month." Eli read it twice. Then he walked to Dora Marsh's back room, where Clara was sitting at the table. She was always at the table now, or standing at the window, or moving carefully around the small room, with her hands clasped behind her back, the way she did when she was thinking hard about something, and he set the letter in front of her, without a word. She read it. She read it again. Then she set it down flat on the table and pressed both palms over it and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. That was all. When she opened them, she was already thinking about the next thing. "A month," she said. "Give or take. I need to be back at the forge before he arrives." She looked up at him. "I need to be working. I need the town to see that I'm working. If Beaumont arrives and I'm hiding in Dora's back room, it looks like defeat. I need to look like exactly what I am." "What are you?" Eli asked. "A woman who has not gone anywhere," Clara said. He thought about that. Whitfield won't like it. Whitfield isn't going to like any part of what's coming. He might as well start practicing now. She stood slowly. The weight of the baby made everything slower, now more deliberate, and she folded Beaumont's letter and held it. "How are things in town?" Eli had been moving through Harlan's Creek carefully these past 2 weeks, the way he'd learned to move through difficult places during his Pinkerton years, not invisibly, because a man his size was never truly invisible, but quietly letting people get used to the fact of him before they decided what they thought of him. He ate breakfast at the same counter every morning. He tipped his hat to people. He didn't get into arguments. He listened more than he spoke, which came naturally, and what he heard over coffee, and over the sounds of commerce, and over the particular frequency of a small town settling into its daily grievances was useful. "Divided," he told her, "more than Croft would want them to be. Ruth Hennessy's been talking. Quietly, but she's been talking. Her husband too, he mentioned Tuesday morning to 3 of his patients last week in ways that weren't accidental." He paused. "But Whitfield's been talking too. He's been telling people you're unstable, that you came back to town and caused trouble, and that the situation is more complicated than it appears." Clara's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes went sharp. "More complicated than it appears," she repeated. "He's suggesting the child's father is a married man, someone prominent, that the whole thing is a scandal you're trying to manage by making yourself a victim." The room was very quiet. "He doesn't know who the father is," Clara said. Her voice was even. "Nobody in this town knows because it's nobody's business, and I've been careful about that. So Whitfield is inventing a story." "Yes." "Good," Clara said. Eli looked at her. "Good. A man who invents stories leaves traces. Invented stories have edges that don't line up the way true ones do. People remember what they were actually told versus what they're claiming they were told." She set down the letter. "Every lie Whitfield tells is something Judge Beaumont can examine. I want you to write down everything you've heard, every version of his story, and who told it to you and when." Eli almost smiled. Not quite smiling didn't come easily to him. and he was always vaguely suspicious of it when it came too easy to others, but almost. "You think like an investigator," he said. "I think like a blacksmith," Clara said. "Everything has a structure. Everything has weak points. You just have to find them." She went back to Dora's forge that Friday. Eli walked beside her. He hadn't asked if he could. She hadn't asked him to. It was one of the things they had worked out between them without discussion, a grammar of presence and absence that had developed over 2 weeks of shared meals and long silences and conversations that went deep quickly because neither of them had any patience for the shallow kind. The walk through town was not comfortable. Clara felt every eye on the street, every curtain that shifted, every conversation that paused as they passed. She kept her chin level and her pace steady. Eli walked at her left, one step behind, and she was aware of him. The way you're aware of something solid when you're standing on uncertain ground, not leaning on it, just knowing it was there. The forge was exactly as she'd left it. They'd taken her from it in the dark before dawn, and had apparently not bothered to come back, which told her something they'd expected her to run, not return. The cold fire, the tools on their hooks, the tin box still under the floorboard. She checked the box first, everything intact. She banked the fire. She picked up a hammer. She went to work. By mid-morning, 3 people had come by. 2 of them had work for her legitimate orders, a hinge repair and a set of horseshoe nails, and one was a boy of about 10, who stood in the doorway and stared until she looked at him directly, and he ran. By afternoon, Cole Whitfield came. He didn't come alone. He brought a man she didn't recognize, younger than Whitfield, well-dressed in the way of someone who wanted to appear more successful than he was, and they stood at the entrance to the forge, and Whitfield looked at her working, and his expression went through several things in quick succession that he was not quite skilled enough to conceal. "Miss Gray," he said, "I heard you were back." "Mr. Whitfield." Clara did not stop working, did not look up. "I'm a little busy." Whitfield stepped inside. The other man stayed at the door. "I think we should talk. About your situation." He paused. "I want you to know that I bear you no ill will. What happened last week was—" Another pause. "Regrettable. But the fact remains that you're in a difficult position, financially, practically, and I want you to know that my offer still stands." Now Clara stopped. She set down the hammer and looked at him fully. "You're here to buy my property," she said. "The week after I was publicly flogged, while I'm 7.5 months pregnant. That's your timing." Whitfield spread his hands in a gesture that was probably meant to communicate reasonableness. "I'm trying to help." "You're trying to purchase land you believe I'll be too broken to keep." Clara's voice was completely flat. "You and Preacher Croft have spent 6 months making sure this town would see me as someone undeserving of protection or solidarity. And then last Tuesday you arranged a public humiliation designed to break my reputation permanently, and now you're here in my forge, my father's forge, to offer me help." She picked up the hammer again. "I won't be selling Mr. Whitfield. Not now. Not after Beaumont arrives. Not ever." The name landed. She watched it land. Watched Whitfield's expression do something involuntary. A flicker of calculation that he covered almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. "Beaumont," he said. His voice was carefully neutral. "Judge Arthur Beaumont, Federal Circuit. He'll be in Harlan's Creek within the month." Clara held Whitfield's gaze. "I imagine you have things to put in order before then." "I'd start with your arrangement with Croft, and your arrangement with Deputy Potts, and the specific language in my father's loan agreement, because a federal judge is going to want to look at all 3, and they need to tell the same story, which in my experience becomes very difficult when the story was never quite true to begin with." Whitfield stared at her. The young man in the doorway had gone very still. "Good day, Mr. Whitfield," Clara said, and went back to work. They left. Clara kept hammering until she heard Eli's step behind her. She hadn't heard him come in. He moved quietly for a man his size, but she'd known he was somewhere nearby. She'd counted on it. "How much of that did you hear?" she asked. "Enough," he said. "The young man at the door. Do you know him?" "He came in on the stage from Dodge 3 days ago. Name's Patterson. He's a lawyer." Clara's hammer paused. "Whitfield brought a lawyer." "Appears so." She thought about that. The fire crackled. Outside, the town made its ordinary sounds. "He's preparing something. Either he's going to try to call in the debt early, find some clause, some technicality, or he's going to try to discredit me formally before Beaumont arrives. Make a legal record that paints me as incapable of managing the property." "Or both," Eli said. "Or both," Clara agreed. She set down the hammer, turned to face him. "Can you get to Ruth Hennessy tonight and her husband?" "Yes." "Tell them I need their statements written and signed before the end of the week. Every specific thing they're willing to put their names to. Every date, every conversation, everything they know about Whitfield's relationship with Croft and Potts. It needs to be documented before Whitfield's lawyer finds a way to make them afraid to speak." Eli nodded. "I'll go this evening." "One more thing." Clara hesitated, not from uncertainty. She knew what she wanted to say, but from the particular care she took with important things. The habit of precision she'd inherited from Thomas Gray. The man Patterson. He didn't look at Whitfield the way employees look at employers. He looked at him the way people look at someone they're not entirely comfortable with, like there's something he knows that he wishes he didn't. Eli was quiet for a moment. "You think he might be manageable?" "I think a lawyer who's been brought in to do something he's not proud of is sometimes a lawyer who's looking for a reason to do something else instead." She met Eli's eyes. "I'm not saying to approach him. Not yet. But watch him." Eli looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of deepening attention, the look of a man revising an assessment upward. "All right," he said. He started to go. Then Clara said, "Eli, when you worked for Pinkerton, did you ever lose a case?" He stopped, turned halfway. "Yes." "How?" "The ones I lost," he said carefully, "were the ones where the other side had more time to build their story than I had to dismantle it." He paused. "You don't have much time, Miss Gray." "I know." She picked up the hammer. "That's why I'm not stopping." The first attempt came 4 days later. Deputy Harlan Potts showed up at the forge just after noon with a folded document and the expression of a man who had been told what to do and was doing it without particular enthusiasm. He waited while Clara finished the nail she was shaping, then held out the document. "It's a notice," he said, "from Whitfield's legal representative. Says there's a question about the property line on the east side of your lot. Claims your father's original survey was inaccurate and that a portion of the land may belong to Whitfield's adjoining property." Clara took the document, read it again. "This is not a legal proceeding," she said. "This is a piece of paper made to look like one. I'm just delivering it." "You're just delivering it." She looked at him. "Harlan, how long have you known my family?" He looked at the floor. Old habit, apparently. "Harlan, look at me." He looked up. He was a tired man. She could see that tired in the way of someone who had made small compromises for so long that the weight of them had accumulated into something enormous. He'd probably started with something minor, a favor here, a turned blind eye there, and somewhere along the way had ended up tied to Whitfield so thoroughly he couldn't see a way out. "I know what my father's survey said," Clara said, keeping her voice even. "I have the original document. I have the deed. This claim has no basis, and whoever wrote it knows it has no basis, and when Judge Beaumont examines it, it's going to look like exactly what it is: harassment executed through legal-seeming means by a man who is very afraid of what a federal court is going to find. She held the document out to him. "Take this back." Potts didn't take it. "I can't." "Harlan." She stepped closer to him. Not threatening, she had no interest in threatening Harlan Potts, who was ultimately a weak man in a bad situation, rather than a malicious one. "I know you didn't choose Tuesday. I know you stood there and tied the ropes because you didn't see another way. I'm not asking you to account for that right now. But I need you to understand that what's coming, what Beaumont's going to look at, is going to include every decision made in this town for the past 6 months. And a man who was present for all of it, who said nothing and did nothing, has a great deal more to lose than a man who—" She paused. "Who starts making different decisions." Potts stared at her. His jaw worked. "Think about it," Clara said. She set the document on the bench beside the forge. "And take that with you." He took it. He left without another word. Clara listened to his boots on the path outside. She was aware that her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the concentrated effort of holding everything steady, the constant management of her own expression and voice and body, when her back still ached and her son was pressing on her ribs and she was more tired than she'd been in her life. She would not show the tiredness, not here, not yet. She heard the front door of the forge, the smaller side door, the one that opened from the alley, and then Eli was there. He'd been nearby. She hadn't asked him to be. He simply had been. "You all right?" he asked. "No," Clara said. Honestly, it was a habit she'd developed with him. Honesty, the undecorated kind, because he responded to it the way most people don't, without trying to fix it or reassure her past it. He just let it be what it was. "But I'm working." Potts looked shaken when he left. "Good." She picked up the hammer. "He should be." Eli leaned against the doorframe and was quiet for a moment. Then, "Patterson was in the saloon last night. He had more to drink than a man on business usually does." Clara looked at him. "He was talking to himself mostly, but I was at the next table." Eli's voice was neutral, reporting the way he'd probably sounded in Pinkerton reports long ago. He said something about a survey. He said, and this is close to exact, he said, "A man can be paid to make a survey say what it doesn't say, but he can't be paid enough to unfalsify it once someone's looking." The forge was very quiet. "He knows," Clara said. "He knows." Eli confirmed. He may have been the one to look at the original survey and realize the claim can't hold. And he's not comfortable. Clara set down the hammer very deliberately. She thought about her father, about the tin box under the floorboard, about the way he had filed every document with the same care he gave to good metalwork. She thought about the original survey which was in that box, which had been in that box for 20 years, which would say exactly what it said, regardless of what any lawyer from Dodge wanted it to say. "Find a way to speak to him privately," she said. "Not to offer him anything, just to let him know that when Beaumont arrives, there's a difference between a witness who came forward and a witness who had to be subpoenaed." Eli nodded once. Outside the town of Harlan's Creek went about its afternoon. People went to the mercantile and argued about the price of flour, and complained about the weather, and talked about everything except what was building in the town around them. The slow, documentable accumulation of evidence that was going to change things, that was already changing things whether anyone was ready for it or not. Clara picked up the hammer. She kept working. She was above all things a blacksmith's daughter. She knew that the metal doesn't yield to wishing. It yields to sustained, directed, relentless force. And she had a great deal of force left. Judge Arthur Beaumont arrived on a Thursday, which was not the day anyone was expecting him. Eli had estimated the end of the month. Whitfield's lawyer Patterson had apparently estimated the same, because when Beaumont's wagon rolled into Harlan's Creek at 10:30 on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the letter had been sent. The first person to see it was Dora Marsh, who was standing outside her house doing nothing in particular, which was her right, and who walked directly to the forge to tell Clara without stopping to tell anyone else first. Clara heard the wagon herself before Dora finished speaking. She set down her work and untied her apron and went to the forge entrance and watched it come down the main road, a plain wagon, no federal markings, driven by a young man in a brown coat with a rifle across his knees. Beside him sat a compact man in his 60s with a gray beard trimmed to military precision, and a black coat that had been good quality 20 years ago, and still was because he'd taken care of it. He was reading something. He looked up when this wagon slowed, and his eyes moved across the street, the way a man's eyes move when he's been assessing new places for 40 years and it's become reflex. His eyes found Clara in the forge entrance. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way you nod at someone you've been told to expect. Clara nodded back. Eli appeared beside her. He'd come from somewhere she hadn't heard him. She never heard him, and he stood at her shoulder and watched the wagon pull up to the boarding house. "Earlier than I thought," he said. "He's been doing this long enough to know that early is the only advantage a judge ever has," Clara said. "Whitfield doesn't know he's here yet." "No. How long before he does?" Eli looked at the street. "This town 20 minutes. It was closer to 15. Clara was back at the forge working with the deliberate steadiness she'd maintained for 3 weeks when she heard raised voices from the direction of Whitfield's mercantile. She couldn't make out the words, but she recognized the shape of them. The sharp, compressed urgency of a man who has just received information he was not prepared for and is trying to reorganize everything he thought he knew. She kept hammering. Steady. Directed. Relentless. Ruth Hennessy came at noon. She slipped in through the side door with her husband behind her. Dr. James Hennessy, a thin, careful man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who had the quality rare in men of his position of listening more than he spoke. He carried a leather folder, the kind used for documents. "He's at the boarding house," Ruth said. "He's already asked to speak with the sheriff." "Harlan's Creek doesn't have a sheriff," Clara said. "It has Deputy Potts." "Exactly," Ruth said. Her voice had taken on a quality Clara had been watching develop over the past 3 weeks. Something firmer than it had been the day she arrived with bread and salve. Something that had been growing with each conversation, each decision. Each morning, she woke up and chose again to be on the right side of what was happening. Beaumont apparently asked 3 times who the law enforcement jurisdiction was, and Patterson had to explain 3 times that the deputy reports to no sheriff, only to the county seat, which is 40 miles away, and hasn't sent anyone to look at anything in Harlan's Creek in 6 years. "Good," Clara said. "That's in my documentation." Dr. Hennessy stepped forward. He held out the leather folder. "Our statements," he said. His voice was quiet and precise. "Everything Ruth and I are prepared to testify to, signed and dated. There are also statements from 2 of my patient's men who work Whitfield's land, and who have told me separately over the past 2 years about arrangements Whitfield has with Croft regarding the church building fund. Money that was supposed to be tithed, but was redirected." He paused. "I've been a doctor long enough to know that what people tell you in confidence and what they'll put their name to are different things. These men agreed to put their names to it." Clara took the folder. "Thank you, James." He looked at her directly, seriously, over the top of his spectacles. "I should have come sooner. To the forge. To Dora's. I should have. There were things I could have said earlier that might have—" He stopped. "I'm sorry, Clara." "You're here now," Clara said. "That's what matters right now." He nodded, and the nod had something in it that was both gratitude and grief, and she understood it, and she let it be. After they left, Eli took the folder and read through every statement, carefully standing at the forge with the pages tilted toward the light. Clara watched him read, the particular focused stillness of him, the way his eyes moved with professional precision, not reading for the story, but reading for the gaps, the inconsistencies, the places where an opposing lawyer might find purchase. "This is good," he said when he'd finished. "Hennessy is credible. His patients are credible. The redirected funds, if Beaumont can get Whitfield's banking records, which he can with a federal writ, it corroborates everything here. Can he get a writ quickly? If he's already asked about the jurisdictional situation, he's already thinking about what he needs." Eli handed the folder back. "He didn't come early by accident, Miss Gray. He came early because he read my letter carefully, and he knows what's here." Clara held the folder against her chest and was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the town reorienting itself around the fact of a federal judge, the way a river reorients around a new obstruction, the same energy just rerouted, looking for the path that still flows. "What happens to Potts?" she asked, "when this is over?" Eli considered it. "Depends on what he does in the next few days." "I told him there was a difference between a witness who came forward and one who had to be subpoenaed." "Did he hear you?" "I think so. Whether he believed me is a different question." She paused. "He's not a bad man." "No," Eli said. "He's a man who made bad choices because he was afraid, and then made more bad choices because he'd already made the first ones, and the longer you wait, the harder it gets." He was quiet for a beat. "I've seen that before." There was something in how he said it that made Clara look at him carefully. He didn't meet her eyes. He was looking at this forge fire, and his expression had done something inward private, the expression of a man touching a piece of his own history that he hadn't offered up. She didn't ask. She filed it away the way she filed most things about him carefully, without pressing, understanding that Eli Maddox communicated the important things on his own schedule, and that patience was the right instrument here. Beaumont sent for her that afternoon. The message came through the young man in the brown coat who introduced himself as Thomas Webb, federal clerk, and delivered the summons with the kind of polite formality that made it clear it was a request in the same way that gravity was a suggestion. Clara washed her hands, changed her shirt, picked up the leather folder with the statements, and walked to the boarding house with Eli beside her. Beaumont was in the parlor. He stood when she came in, stood, which she noticed, and which told her something about the kind of man he was, before he'd said a word and offered his hand. "Miss Gray." His handshake was brief and firm. "I'm Arthur Beaumont. Sit down, please. You shouldn't be standing more than you have to." Clara sat. Eli stood behind her a little to the left. Beaumont's eyes went to him briefly, an assessment efficient and unobtrusive, and then back to Clara. "Mr. Maddox's letter was thorough," Beaumont said. "I've been doing this work for 31 years. I've learned to read the letters that tell me what they're not saying as much as what they are." He settled back in his chair and laced his fingers together. "Tell me what you want me to know that wasn't in the letter." So Clara told him. She told him the way she'd told Ruth, the way she'd told Eli in Dora's back room, with precision from the foundation up, without embellishment or appeal to sympathy. She laid out the timeline. She laid out the financial structure. She laid out what had happened on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago factually, with specificity about who was present and what their roles were. She put the folder on the table between them and watched Beaumont go through it the same way Eli had, professionally looking for what held and what didn't. He was quiet for a while after he finished reading. Then, "The loan agreement. You have the original." "At the forge, under the floorboard, my father kept every document." "I'll need it." "I'll bring it tomorrow morning." Beaumont looked at her steadily. He had the eyes of a man who had heard a great many stories and had developed the ability to tell the ones that were true from the ones that merely wanted to be. "Miss Gray," he said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I'd like a direct answer." "All right." "The child's father. Is there any version of Whitfield's story, any version at all, that implicates someone with standing in this community in a way that would complicate this case?" Clara held his gaze. "No. The child's father is a man who was passing through. He left before I knew I was expecting. There is no version of Whitfield's story that is true, because Whitfield does not know who the father is, and the story he's telling was invented to serve his purposes. I can't prove the father's identity because I have no means of reaching a man who has no fixed address. What I can prove is that everything Whitfield has claimed about it is fabricated because the timeline doesn't match what he's asserting. Beaumont nodded slowly. All right. He made a note. One more question, Deputy Potts. Do you believe he's reachable? Clara thought about Harlan Potts's boots and the rope around her wrists and the 3 seconds he'd stood outside her forge with the fraudulent survey notice before she'd sent him away. I think, she said carefully, that he is a man who has run out of directions to look except at what he's done. I think the question is whether he's reached the point where the weight of it is worse than the cost of changing course. Beaumont looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Eli. Mr. Maddox, you were Pinkerton. 8 years. You left on good terms. A pause. On honest terms, Eli said. Beaumont seemed to find this acceptable. I'm going to need someone with investigative experience to help me compile what's here into a formal evidentiary record before I can proceed. My clerk is competent, but young. If you're willing. I'm willing, Eli said. Beaumont stood. Clara stood too. He looked at her, at the evidence of what she was carrying and what she'd been through, and the way she stood anyway, level and certain, and his expression didn't go soft exactly. But something in it acknowledged what it was seeing. Miss Gray, he said, I've seen a great many cases where the injury was obvious and the evidence was absent. And I've seen cases where the evidence was abundant and the courage to use it was not. He paused. You seem to have both. My father taught me to keep records, Clara said. Your father taught you well. She walked back to the forge with Eli in the late afternoon, the folder under her arm, and Beaumont's words still moving through her. Around her, Harlan's Creek felt different, charged with something, the particular atmospheric quality of a situation approaching its resolution, like weather building before a storm breaks. She could feel it in the way people watched her from doorways, in the too casual movements of men who were trying to appear unconcerned. She was almost to the forge when she saw Potts. He was standing against the wall of the feed store, and he wasn't pretending to do anything. Not leaning casually, not looking away. He was just standing there, waiting for her to come by, which was a change from every previous encounter where he'd managed to avoid direct contact. When she stopped, he straightened. He's here, Potts said, meaning Beaumont. Not a question. He is. Potts looked at the ground, then up. He'd made some kind of decision. She could see it, the particular quality of a man who has crossed a threshold and knows there's no uncrossing it. The survey, he said. The one Whitfield's lawyer put together. I was told to deliver it as an official county notice. I knew it wasn't. I delivered it anyway. He stopped. I've been a deputy for 11 years. I know what a legal document looks like. Clara waited. If the judge needs someone to testify about the delivery of that notice, Potts said, and about the instructions I received regarding it, and about who gave those instructions, I'll do that. I'll put my name to it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Why? He met her eyes. Because I tied the ropes, he said. And I know what I did. Something moved through Clara's chest. Not warmth, exactly. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something adjacent. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of a man who had found at some point between the forge and this moment the version of himself he was willing to be. Come to the boarding house tomorrow morning at 9, she said. Ask for Judge Beaumont. Tell him I sent you. Potts nodded. He stepped back. He walked away without looking behind him. Eli had stopped a few paces back, giving her the space of the conversation. When she came back to him, he looked at her with a question he didn't ask. Potts, she said simply. He understood immediately. All right. Tomorrow morning is going to be important, Clara said. They walked on toward the forge. Whitfield is going to realize that Beaumont is working faster than he expected, and he's going to do something. People who are cornered either go still or they lunge. Whitfield is not a still man. No, Eli agreed. He's not. They reached the forge. Clara went inside, and the familiar warmth of it met her, the smell of iron and ash, and the particular quality of heat that had been her father's and was now hers, and she stood in the middle of it for a moment with her eyes closed. She was 8 months pregnant. Her back ached every day, a deep persistent ache that she had built a relationship with, accepting it the way you accept weather. She had not slept more than 4 hours in a row since before Tuesday. She had been thinking, planning, calculating, maintaining, managing, and working every waking hour, and beneath all of it, beneath the structure and the strategy and the steadiness she presented to every person she dealt with, there was a tiredness so deep she could feel it in her bones. But she was still here. That was the thing. She was still here. She opened her eyes. Eli was leaning against the doorframe. He always seemed to find the doorframe as though he understood intuitively that a room needed someone to hold its edges, and he was watching her with that particular quality of attention that had no agenda in it, no expectation, just presence. "You should eat something," he said. "I know." "And sleep." "I will." She looked at him. "Eli, after this is over." "Don't," he said quietly. She stopped. "After this is over," he said, "is after this is over. Right now is right now." He straightened from the doorframe. "I'll get food from Dora. You sit down for 10 minutes. Not because you need someone to tell you to, but because your son probably wants you to." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down on the bench beside the forge and put her hand over the place where Thomas was. She had decided on the name. Had decided it without ceremony, because her father deserved it, and she felt the small, determined presence of him, patient and waiting, and entirely unbothered by the scale of what was happening around him. She thought about Miriam Grafton, who had drawn a picture of a man and a small girl because she saw something worth drawing and couldn't help herself. She thought about a quiet boy who had sat outside the school and watched the other children and never been let inside. She thought about what it meant that the boy had grown into this man and that this man had come to Harlan's Creek with his mother's drawing in his pocket. She thought about paper and what it remembers. Tomorrow, Beaumont would begin the formal process. Tomorrow, Potts would walk through the boarding house door and become a witness instead of a conspirator. Tomorrow, Whitfield would feel the shape of what was closing around him, and he would lunge the way cornered men do. And Clara would be ready. She had been ready in some way for longer than she could name, sharpened by years of early mornings and difficult work, and the particular education of being a woman who refused to be small in a place that wanted her to be. She sat on the bench with her hand over her son, and she rested and she gathered herself. Because tomorrow was going to take everything she had. Whitfield lunged on Friday morning. Clara had predicted it, and still the shape of it surprised her, not in its cruelty, which she'd been prepared for, but in its smallness. She had expected something legal, something involving Patterson and documents and the county seat. She had not expected him to come to the forge himself before dawn with 2 men she'd never seen before and a lit torch. She smelled it first. The particular smell of burning cloth. Not the forge fire, not wood. Something else, something wrong. And she was up from her cot in Dora's back room before she was fully awake, moving toward the smell with the animal certainty of someone who had spent years understanding fire and what it did when it got loose. The forge was not burning. They'd tried the house first. Her father's house, the small one adjacent to the property, and the fire hadn't caught the way they'd wanted because the wood was old and tight and the night was slightly damp. What burned was the front porch and part of the door. When Clara came around the corner and saw it, one of the men was still standing nearby, not quite running, not quite staying, caught between what he'd been paid to do and the reality of doing it. She looked at him. He ran. She looked at the second man. He ran also. Whitfield was not there. Of course he was not there. Men like Whitfield never stood where they could be seen, doing the things they'd arranged to have done. Clara beat the porch fire out with a grain sack she'd grabbed from the forge, working fast and methodically without panic, because panic was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. By the time the fire was out, Eli was there where he'd come from. She didn't ask, and he was looking at the door and the scorched porch boards, with his jaw set and his eyes doing something she hadn't seen them do before. "You're all right," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm all right." She looked at the damage. "He's afraid. This is what afraid looks like." "This is what criminal looks like," Eli said. "This is arson." He turned to face her fully. "This ends today, Clara." It was the first time he'd used her name. Not Miss Gray, not Ma'am Clara. She registered it the way you register a change in the weather, something that has shifted and will not shift back. "Yes," she said. "It does." She went to the boarding house at 6 in the morning before most of the town was stirring. She knocked on Beaumont's door and he answered it already dressed, which told her he hadn't slept much either, or that he'd heard the commotion and drawn his own conclusions. She told him what had happened. Precise, factual, in the same tone she used for everything. She told him about the two men and what they'd done and what they hadn't managed to do. She told him about the sack and the boards and the smell. Beaumont listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You should have come to me last night." "Nothing had happened last night that hadn't already been documented," Clara said. "Something has happened now." He was quiet for a moment. Then, Webb. The young clerk appeared from the next room already holding a pen. "I need a federal writ prepared. Seizure of financial records pertaining to Cole Whitfield, his accounts at the county bank and all business correspondence between Whitfield Elias Croft and Harlan Potts over the past 3 years. And I need a notice of formal proceedings served to Whitfield before noon." He looked back at Clara. "The fire changes the nature of this. This is no longer a property dispute or a civil matter of community conduct. This is a criminal act." "I need you to do something else," Clara said. "What?" "I need you to hear Potts this morning, before anything else, before Whitfield knows what's moving." She paused. "He came to me yesterday of his own will. He's ready to talk. If Whitfield gets to him first, if he frightens him back into silence." "I'll see Potts at 7, Beaumont said, "before anything is served." "Thank you." She walked back through the quiet morning street, and she did not feel triumphant. Not yet, there was no room for that. Not while things were still in motion, but she felt something she recognized as alignment, the particular sensation of a mechanism operating as it was designed to every piece in its proper place. Potts arrived at 7 and stayed for 2 hours. Clara knew because Eli watched the boarding house and told her, and because when Potts finally came out, his face had the look of a man who has put down something very heavy that he'd been carrying for a long time. He did not look relieved exactly. He looked lighter and frightened simultaneously, which was about right. Patterson came out of the boarding house 20 minutes after Potts, and he did not look like a man who'd been summoned. He looked like a man who had gone voluntarily carrying his own leather folder, which was thicker than it had been when Clara last saw it. She was at the forge when Eli came to tell her. Patterson turned, Eli said. Clara stopped what she was doing. Turned how? He brought Beaumont the original survey, the real one commissioned by Whitfield, before he had it altered, and the correspondence between Whitfield and the surveyor about what changes to make. He'd kept copies. He wasn't supposed to, but he'd kept them. Eli leaned against the doorframe. He said he'd been told the case against you was routine. A land dispute, a difficult woman's straightforward work. He said, when he got here and looked at the actual documents and the actual situation, he understood that he'd been hired to participate in a fraud. He said he wasn't willing to take a federal charge to protect Cole Whitfield's real estate interests. Clara was quiet for a long moment. He had the correspondence. Written in Whitfield's hand, specific instructions about what the survey should say with a payment amount. Dated. Eli paused. It's over, Clara. Beaumont has what he needs. She set down her hammer. She put both hands flat on the workbench and pressed down and breathed. And Croft. Webb served him this morning. There are federal questions about the church fund and the nature of what happened 3 weeks ago. Beaumont is characterizing Tuesday morning as unlawful confinement and aggravated assault, which is exactly what it was. Croft is currently at the church, and according to 3 separate people who walked past it this morning, he's been in there since 9 o'clock and hasn't come out. He's praying, Clara said. Probably. He should be. She straightened. And Whitfield. Eli's expression shifted slightly, not darker exactly, but more deliberate, the look of someone choosing words with care. He's at his mercantile. He's been there since the notice was served. He's alone. Patterson left him. The 2 men who were at your property this morning are gone, rode out before sunup by the look of it. His own men, people who worked for him. He paused. He's alone, and he knows what's coming, and there's nothing he can do about it. Clara nodded slowly. She thought about her father filing papers in the tin box. She thought about paper and what it remembers even when people don't want it to. I want to go, she said. Eli looked at her. Go where? To the hearing, whatever Beaumont convenes this afternoon. I want to be in that room. She met his eyes. I have been managed and handled and kept away from everything that concerns me my entire life. I want to be in that room. All right, Eli said. You'll be in that room. Beaumont convened a formal proceeding at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the dining room of the boarding house, which was the largest interior space in Harlan's Creek, that wasn't a church and wasn't Whitfield's mercantile. The table was pushed to one end, and chairs were arranged with the attention to order that Beaumont apparently brought to everything. Webb sat to one side with a ledger for the official record. Clara sat across from the judge. Eli sat beside her. Ruth Hennessy was there, and her husband and the 2 men from Whitfield's land who had given Hennessy their statements and had apparently decided that if they'd put their names to it, they might as well see it through. Potts came in last, sat in the corner, and looked at the table. Whitfield arrived with no one beside him, which said everything about what had happened in the past 24 hours. He sat where Beaumont indicated 2 chairs from Clara, and he did not look at her. His hands were on the table, and they were still, and she gave him credit for that, whatever else he was. He had a kind of cold composure that didn't break easily, and she had not expected it to. Beaumont opened without preamble. He explained the federal jurisdiction, clearly, briefly, leaving no room for argument about whether this proceeding was legitimate. He outlined the nature of the evidence before him. He did not editorialize. He stated facts in the way that Clara had come to understand, was his manner precisely sequentially allowing the facts themselves to carry the weight that in another man might have come from rhetoric. When he got to the survey fraud, Whitfield spoke. The survey was a mistake, Whitfield said. His voice was controlled. My representative engaged a surveyor who made errors. I was not aware of the specific... Mr. Whitfield. Beaumont's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. I have correspondence in your handwriting that specifies in considerable detail the precise errors you wish the surveyor to make. I also have the payment record. I'm going to ask you not to continue in this direction, because it will not serve you. The room was very still.
Right.
Whitfield looked at the table. As to the events of the 14th, Beaumont continued, the 14th, the date clinical and exact, which somehow made it more real than any emotional language could have. I have sworn statements from 6 witnesses. I have testimony from Deputy Potts, who was present and participated. I have your own correspondence with Preacher Croft from May of this year, in which you reference necessary measures regarding Miss Gray's property and the need to resolve her situation before the debt term. I'm going to ask you now, Mr. Whitfield, a simple question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer it. Did you at any time direct, suggest, encourage, or fund any action taken against Clara Gray or her property, including the events of the 14th and including the fire set at her house in the early hours of this morning? Silence. Whitfield's hands on the table did not move. Clara watched him. She watched him calculate, she could almost see it, the rapid assessment of what was known, what could still be denied, what was already past saving. And she watched him arrive at the same place every man like him eventually arrived at, which was the moment when the structure he'd built collapsed inward all at once. I want to speak to a lawyer, Whitfield said. Patterson has recused himself from your representation, Beaumont said. You are entitled to legal counsel. This proceeding will pause for 48 hours to allow you to arrange it. However, the federal seizure of your financial records and correspondence stands, and you are not to leave Harlan's Creek during that period. He looked at Whitfield steadily. I'd suggest using the time to think carefully about the difference between what can be proven and what can be negotiated, and to consider that cooperation at this stage carries significantly more weight than cooperation after the fact. Whitfield stood. He did not look at anyone. He walked out. The room let out a breath it had been holding. Clara sat still for a moment. She could hear her own heartbeat, which was steady and even, which surprised her. She'd expected to feel some larger rush of something, but what she felt was quieter than that. More like the feeling at the end of a very long piece of work when you step back and look at it and know it's right. Not triumph. Something more durable. Ruth Hennessy put her hand on Clara's arm briefly. She didn't say anything. Clara was glad she didn't. Beaumont looked across the table. Miss Gray, the loan agreement. Clara opened the folder she'd brought and produced it, the original, her father's handwriting on the signature line. The terms clear and unambiguous, and free of any provision that a lawyer would need to fabricate a property survey to enforce. She slid it across the table. Beaumont read it. There is no abandonment clause, he said. No, sir. There never was. The provision Whitfield's representative described to you does not exist in this document. Clara paused. My father kept everything. He trusted paper. Beaumont looked at her over the document. Something moved through his expression, not softness, but acknowledgement, the recognition one careful person extends to another. So do I, he said. It took Beaumont 3 days to complete the formal evidentiary record, during which time Harlan's Creek underwent the particular discomfort of a community forced to look at itself. The conversations that had happened behind closed doors since the 14th began happening in the open. The women who had cried quietly in the crowd and done nothing found ways to stop by the forge. Some of them brought things, breadcloth, small practical offerings that were also apologies of a kind, and Clara accepted each of them without ceremony and without absolution, because absolution was not hers to give, and she wasn't sure it was what they were really asking for anyway. What they were asking for, she thought, was the chance to be different going forward, and that was something she could give simply by still being here. Preacher Croft did not come to her. He left the church and Harlan's Creek on the second day in a wagon with his belongings, without a sermon or a farewell or any public accounting. The congregation he left behind held a quiet meeting and were still, as far as Clara knew, figuring out what came next. On the third day, Whitfield made a formal settlement offer through a new lawyer brought in from Dodge. He agreed to forgive the remaining debt on the property in exchange for a lesser federal charge cooperation, as Beaumont had said, carrying its own weight. He agreed to financial restitution to Clara for damages, including the attempted arson. He agreed never to make another offer of purchase for the Gray property as long as Clara Gray or her heirs held it. He signed his name to it. Clara held the signed document for a long time. She thought about her father. She thought about the tin box and everything it held, and the discipline it had taken to keep it year after year, receipt by receipt, letter by letter, trusting that the record mattered even when no one was looking at it. "Papa," she said quietly to no one in the room. It held. Thomas was born on a Sunday morning 4 weeks later in Dora Marsh's back room, with Ruth Hennessy's hands and her husband's calm, and Dora's complete practical competence, and the sound of the town going about its Sunday outside the window. He came into the world as quietly as his mother bore him, no wasted drama, just a focused, purposeful arrival, and then a small, outraged cry that settled almost immediately into something more considering, as though he was listening to the room taking stock. Clara held him against her chest and looked at his face, and he looked back at her with the dark, searching eyes of a person who has just discovered the world is larger than expected and is already deciding what to do about it. "Thomas," she said, "that's your name. It was your grandfather's, and he was a good man, and you should know that." Thomas appeared to consider this, and then closed his eyes with the decisive air of someone who has received sufficient information for the moment. Eli was in the doorway. He'd been in the doorway for most of it, outside in the hall, present, in the particular way he'd been present for every part of the past weeks, near enough to matter, and far enough to let the thing be what it was. Now he stood in the actual doorway, hat in his hands, looking at her and the boy with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It was unguarded, just open in the way of something that has been closed for a long time and has finally found the circumstance that justifies opening. "Come in," Clara said. He came in. He stood beside the cot and looked at Thomas, and Thomas, in the way of newborns, gave no indication of caring about him whatsoever, which seemed to suit Eli fine. "He's got your jaw," Eli said. "He's got my father's jaw," Clara said. "Stubborn." "Good." They were quiet. Outside, the Sunday sounds continued. Bells somewhere. The movement of people, a town that had changed was still changing, would keep changing, because that is what towns do when the thing holding them still is removed. "What are you going to do now?" Clara asked. She looked at him because it was a real question, and she wanted to see his face when he answered it. Eli turned his hat in his hands. He looked at her in that steady, considered way she'd come to know, as well as she knew the weight of her own hammer. "I thought I might stay a while," he said, "if that's agreeable." "What would you do?" "There's work." He said it simply. "You've got more orders than you can fill alone, and you've got Thomas now, and there's a lot of work." He paused. "I'm not without skills, though. Most of them are less useful in a forge than in a county with a corrupt deputy and a fraudulent surveyor." "Harlan Potts is still the deputy," Clara said. "He is," Eli agreed. "And he's going to need watching." "You think you can watch a man while also working a forge?" "I think," Eli said, "that I've been watching things from doorways my whole life. Might as well be useful while I'm doing it." Clara looked at him for a long time. This man who had come to Harlan's Creek with his dead mother's drawing in his pocket, who had walked through a crowd without anyone quite knowing why they'd let him through, who had cut a rope in 2 strokes and said nothing, who had understood without being told that she did not need to be rescued, only witnessed, only accompanied, only believed. "It's agreeable," she said. He nodded, turned his hat once more. Then he looked at Thomas, who was sleeping with the absolute unconscious authority of someone with nothing to prove. "He's going to be all right," Eli said. It wasn't a prediction so much as a statement of fact, the way he spoke about all the things he'd decided were true. "We all are," Clara said. She looked down at her son, and she felt the weight of what had passed and the weight of what was coming, and the particular steadiness that comes to a person who has been tested to their precise limit, and has discovered in the testing that the limit is further than anyone told them. She thought about the forge banked and waiting, and the orders on the wall, and the tin box under the floorboard, and the documents in it, one more now, signed by a man who had spent 6 months trying to take everything from her, and had ended up giving her the only thing she'd actually needed, which was the proof that what was hers was hers. Outside Harlan's Creek went about its Sunday. The bells finished. The street settled. A town that had chosen cruelty and would now slowly have to choose something else. Inside, Clara Gray held her son and breathed, and everything that had tried to break her had only made the foundation deeper, and everything they had taken, she had rebuilt stronger. And her name, the name they had spoken like a curse and written into fraudulent documents and tried to bury under shame and silence. Her name was the one still standing. It was the only one that ever would be.